Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this talk about user experience design for astronomy. My name is Jen, and I work at the MAST archive at Space Telescope Science Institute in Baltimore. If you don't know what MAST is, we hold data from over a dozen space telescope missions like Hubble, TESS, and Kepler, and a lot of other ones. And so why is UX design important in astronomy? So this is the MAST mission, but I think it probably applies to a lot of your missions if you're all working in the sciences and astronomy specifically. But our goal is to maximize scientific accessibility and productivity of astronomical data. And I highlighted the word accessibility because we put all of our data that we observe and the tools we make online publicly for free. And we have this public access, but it is totally ineffective if these tools that we're creating are inaccessible due to confusion or a steep learning curve. And that's where design comes in, because good design will maximize the accessibility of your data. And just a note here, it does take focused work to create a good design. It's not something that will just magically happen. It's something that you need to put effort into. And so I'm going to go through my steps of how I work on design and try to make our tools more usable. So step one, establish a goal. So I always start by setting a purpose to what the interface that I'm working on. I write out the problem that I'm solving and the audience I'm solving it for. And this is really helpful because I'll come back to this when making decisions later, and it helps to really focus what our priorities are going to be, because it can get really easy to get off track during the design process. Step two, research. So generally I just talk to people. Depending on what the project is, I'll talk to the potential users, who are usually scientists, and I'll talk to the developers who will be building the tool to figure out what the technical constraints are. I listen to the problems and ideas that people, our future users have, but I like to keep an open mind to the solution, because a lot of times people will specifically ask for a very focused feature, and that might not actually be the answer. It's better to listen to the general problem and try to come up with a solution that works within your system. I also do this by meeting individually, or sometimes I'll run workshops as a group, and I ask a lot of questions. Okay, step three, draw it. So this is a really important step. I spend some time drawing workflow diagrams and screen layouts. Diagrams are really helpful because it gives you a visual to point to during a conversation, and it aids in communication, because it can be really difficult to be clear when talking about something visual. So a lot of times it's important to just make a drawing, and then you'll all be on the same page. So there's different fidelities of drawing, because not everyone has drawing skills, right? So sometimes you could see on the bottom, there's not even actual drawings in that workflow. It's just a bunch of boxes where I'm visually ordering the steps in a workflow. And that can be enough to help to write out your workflow. You don't necessarily need to draw something of a higher fidelity, like on the upper left-hand corner. That's another workflow diagram with more high fidelity mock-ups of what the screens will look like in the workflow. And then on the upper right, I have an example of a low fidelity mock-up. So everything's gray. This is not really what it's meant to look like. I'm just using some boxes and outlines to give a sense of what the screen will look like. Okay, so drawing is a really large, complicated topic. So I've broken it down into a bunch of different design elements to think about. So the first one is workflow. So when trying to design a workflow, first thing to think about is leveraging shared experience. Remember, your users have familiarity with tools and concepts, both in astronomy, other astronomy tools, but also tools that they've used outside of astronomy. So if you're really overwhelmed when trying to write out your workflow, look at other tools and see what you can copy. And in the bottom, I have an example of something I recently copied. So I was trying to work on how to lay out some tools in a toolbar. And then I looked up at Axure, which is the design software I use, and I realized that they had a really nice method of arranging tools in a toolbar. So I just copied it. it's great. These are patterns, design patterns are not owned by anyone. Well, probably in some cases they are. You have to be a little careful, but in general, the world's your oyster. Copy. So more on workflows. This is a really complicated workflow that I was drawing out just to get an understanding of a current system that existed within the MAST archive. As you can see, there's a lot going on here. To be honest, no one really read this other than me. I presented this workflow instead. You could see how much more simple it is. But then after presenting it, I started taking notes on top as everyone was giving more and more feedback and wanting to add to the workflow. So this is to make the point that things are always going to get more complicated while you're designing things. So that's why it's always very, very important to continue to simplify at every stage of the design process, because entropy, right? Things will just keep getting crazier and crazier. So it's your job to always come back to the simplest form. So here's some questions to ask yourself while designing a workflow. What are the steps in the workflow? How many steps are there? Can you remove any? Are those steps clear to the user? Can the workflow be conveyed without separate instructions? And so without the separate instructions, this is where some of the other design elements comes in. And you can use design elements to try to convey this information visually. Okay, yeah, so like I just said, we now apply visual design to create a hierarchy to convey what the user needs to do and the order that they need to do it in. Using visual design to make it more effective than just writing a lot of documentation and many, many paragraphs and hoping people will read it. Okay, so I'm going to break down some concepts of visual design. First, let's talk about hierarchy, which is all about where your eye is drawn first. It's important to create emphasis and express relative importance when designing a user interface, and that's what hierarchy is all about. An easy way that I always think about it, and I think about this when painting, I think about this when looking at any form of design, in fine arts or in tech, it's all about the order that the person's eye is going to move through your composition. And visual design can help you control what order that will be. So the way you create a hierarchy is using different signals. And some of these signals I'll go into later, but just to make a list, and there's more, but size, location, spacing, contrast, and color are all things you can use to signal the user to look in different places at different times. Okay, so let's start with size. Bigger draws more attention. I'm assuming that everyone looked at the right word first and the left word second, which is notable because we generally read from left to right, in English. So we still looked at the word on the right because it was so big and it was right in our face. So that's where our eye went immediately. Location. Okay, I just mentioned this. In English, we read from left to right, top to bottom, and we unconsciously follow that pattern when viewing images and layouts as well. This is different in different cultures, by the way, but in general on the internet, I think this is a pattern that is often followed even internationally. So you read the upper left first and you read the bottom right second. I could be fairly confident that that's the case. Okay, so let's talk about layout. So a helpful tool for creating a layout is using a grid, which is a structure to organize your layout. Gridded designs are easy to visually navigate, and they help lead the viewer through a complex content. So you can look at the screen here. When elements of a page are disorganized, the meaning becomes more difficult to interpret. But when elements of a page are organized neatly, the viewer can easily understand the content and the actions that they can do on the page. So you can see that followed more of a gridded pattern. So here's an example of one of our interfaces in MAST. This is z.mast. And so here's one area where I'm using some grid. There's actually multiple different grids going on in this layout. Okay, let's talk about text. And I think this is a really important one to emphasize in astronomy, because I think people tend to really rely on text in astronomy and rely on documentation when often might not be necessary, maybe is even painful. So remember, when writing, less is more, especially in interface design. Concise writing enables clear communication. You can use a lot of unnecessary words to explain a concept that really only needs fewer words to explain, which confuses the reader and takes them longer to comprehend something that they could have understood more easily if you were just more direct. Less text is more understandable. Would you rather, in a new interface that's already kind of intimidating, right? Would you rather be hit with a wall of text like above, or would you rather read that simple sentence below? A lot of times people use way more words than is necessary. This is true in emails. This is true, really this is true anywhere in life, but it's especially true for user interfaces on the internet. Okay, so some more technical things around text. Something to think about is leading. For readability, it's really important that text, especially multiple lines of text, have enough space between them. But if there's very tight leading, it becomes difficult to read, but the same is true if there's too much leading. If you're not like a professional designer, I think usually defaults are reasonably good for leading, but it's something to keep in mind if you're reading something and you're having trouble and you don't know why. It might have to do with the spacing of the text. Another thing with this is characters per line. Reading text becomes slower and more difficult when there's too many words on one line. Reading text is faster and easier when there's fewer words. And there's a sweet spot in design. Graphic designers tend to agree somewhere between 45 and 75 characters. Characters also include spaces and periods and exclamation points and things. And so this is important to remember, especially in web design, because windows are resizable. So when resizing a window, you don't want your text to just go the entire width of the page. You want to constrain it at a certain point, or else it'll be very hard to read. So to sum it up, you're going to create a workflow, and you're going to list the order of the tasks in the workflow. And then you're going to use all these design elements that I went over to guide a user's attention to the relevant parts of the screen in that order. So you have your workflow, you have this diagram you've made, and you know the order you want the user to move through your app or your website. And then you see how you can use visual design to emphasize different parts of the screen and see where your eye starts moving. Okay, step 4. So this step can happen, step feedback can happen either after you've first created a mock-up of your design by drawing it, or it can happen after you've developed in multiple stages of development. As you start development, even when you're not totally finished, you can reach out to users and try to get usability feedback. You could also do this, after your first release. This is something that's important to do pretty consistently. So to do that, we do usability research, which I like to think about as the science of design, kind of taking design is not, it's not numerical. It's not like, there's not hard truths and falses, right? But trying to make them, try to find out what's true about your design. We're really trying to find out what's confusing from the work you've done and what is missing. So some guidelines to follow when doing usability research. It's really important to ask questions neutrally to the people you're talking to the users. You don't want to accidentally lead them to say that they liked or disliked something, or basically like lead them to say something they wouldn't have said on their own. Also, it's very important not to get defensive, because I know you've been working really hard on this design, and you might have emotions associated with that. But you really shouldn't let anyone you're asking for feedback know that, because they'll be less likely to give you honest feedback. To be honest, when getting feedback, a lot of times it's better to have a totally separate person who has not been involved in designing it be the person who works and talks to users to get the feedback, because people can tell if you have an emotional investment in it. So you don't always have another person to get feedback. So instead, you just need to not be as emotionally invested, or at least not show your emotional investment to the people you're talking to. And remember, as you're getting feedback, not all of the feedback can make it. And this is really important. It's back to the point I made earlier about having to simplify. Some ideas need to be cut to keep clarity. If you take every single bit of feedback that anyone gives you and try to create a new feature out of it and try to shove it into your design, it's going to become very complicated and hard to use. So you need to make sure that when incorporating feedback, your design remains simple. So one way to go about usability research is through interviews. You find people to interview. It's good to try to get users with a variety of different backgrounds and prepare questions ahead of time, but be willing to pivot or dig into a surprise response, something you weren't expecting, and get a good understanding of what the person's talking about. Also, just as a general rule, listen more than you talk and take a lot of notes. I actually think it's almost rude to set up an interview with someone and have them give you their time and not be taking notes about what they're saying. So it's a really important thing to do, and it's important so you could reference it later. One method I use to take notes, particularly in the beginning stages of design, if I'm getting feedback on not a working product, but a mock-up I've done, I will take like digital Post-it notes and write the feedback directly on the part of the workflow that the person's giving feedback on. So that really helps to keep all this feedback in context. So that's a method I use that really helps me keep things organized. Okay, another thing you can do is usability tests, and this is more easily done on a working product, something that's been developed, at least to some extent. It doesn't have to be like the final version. It's possible also to do this with paper prototypes. So there's a few different concepts within usability testing. One is think out loud, where the user is going to articulate experiences as they have them. And then there's also pass and fail. And that takes, basically you pick out certain tasks that need to be done as part of the workflow, and you see if they are completable, or if they're failed, if the user fails and is unable to complete it, you know that it's causing confusion and you know it needs to be reconsidered in your design. So I think usability testing is really foreign to a lot of people, so I've included an example of what a script looks like that I will use. So yeah, and I mentioned script. I will write a script ahead of time that goes through working each of these features that I want to test, and I follow that script for every single person I test. So this was part of a script that we used when testing ExoMAST. So the blue is things I read out loud, and the white is an area that I'm taking notes. So the first task, to give some context, was you are an exoplanet scientist who has come to use ExoMAST to get data. You are looking for observations of trace 2b. Take me to information about trace 2b. Then, so the white data, the white writing that you see is the steps that a user might take in order to complete that task. And so if they complete it, each step, I highlight yes. If they don't, I highlight no. And then basically, I start to get a sense if everyone's able to complete something, I could be reasonably sure that it's probably working. But you know, if one or two people are really struggling on something that I think is supposed to be very straightforward and an important part of the workflow, I know it needs reconsideration. I'll also mix in questions that are more like, okay, now give me feedback. How did that task go for you? How easy or difficult was it for you to find the radius? You know, with 1 being easy and 5 being difficult, rate it. Then I'll also have some follow-up questions. When usability testing, I usually start out with a really simple question, and then I work to more complicated parts of the task, also just to get people comfortable with how usability testing works. Okay, and the final step, step 5, is iterate and repeat, because all of these steps need to happen many, many times and might be in different orders than I listed them, but just the design process goes on and on until probably until the product is done. Like, you know, we're taking it away, no one's using it anymore. So thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions, we have some time now, but I'll also be at the STScI booth if you want to discuss UX or have any other questions. And feel free to contact me at my Space Telescope email.